They're
All
bold to
right.
go.
All right. Well, welcome to our C.S. Lewis, our first event of our C.S. Lewis series, C.S. Lewis Holiday Series. And I'm so grateful to welcome Reverend Andrew Lazo here tonight. I'm going to just go through a few things that are upcoming here at the library in conjunction with C.S. Lewis holidays and other things as well. Um, so, um, so next week we have a few things that are going to be happening. We have Heather Bell, who's going to be talking about her new cookbook that just came out called Mama Bell's Big Family Cookbook. I really recommend you come that night because if you have a large crowd that you're feeding at Christmas time, this is the cookbook for you. And then, as part of our C.S. Lewis holidays, we also have a concert on Wednesday night, December 11th. And it's Superior Pipes and Drums and Friends a holiday concert. So if you like your Christmas music with some bagpipes and drums and fifes and things like that, I really recommend that you come Wednesday night, 6:30 p.m. in the community room here at the library. And then on Thursday, we have our Winter Wonderland Walk celebration. Lots of stuff going on. Our whole library is filled with beautiful Christmas trees decorated by community groups. And so that's going to be there. We're going to have all kinds of snacks for people to have, holiday treats. And then at 6:30 p.m. in the community room, we're going to have another holiday concert by Big Lake Acoustic. And really popular group. If you have not seen them, do yourself a favor and show up that night. And then on next Friday, I don't know if this is good or not, Friday the 13th, we are going to be showing for our docudrama series, C.S. Lewis Holidays, we're going to be showing Shadowlands,
Mm.
starring Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. And if you have never seen that film, it is so worth it. I remember going, I was one of the first people in line when that movie came out and bought my ticket for it. So yeah, lots of great stuff coming up. Please visit our page at pwpl.info to see what we have going on this month of December. So let me tell you a little bit about Reverend Lazo here. He's an internationally known scholar, conference speaker, and writer specializing on C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. If you're not sure who the Inklings are, he's going to tell you about that. He earned his BA with honors from UC Davis and MA in Modernist British Literature from Rice University and a Master's of Divinity with honors from Virginia Theological Seminary. And he is currently the distinguished lecturer in Romantic Theology program at Northwind Theological Seminary, while he's concurrently pursuing his doctorate. You must be very tired.
God gives sleep to those he loves, and I'll take as much of it as I can.
There you go. He is a frequent speaker in the United States and United Kingdom and has given keynote talks and invited lectures at the Smithsonian Institution in Romania, Oxford, and Cambridge and all around the United States. And he's also written several articles on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, which we just celebrated last year, his 100th birthday. And we
Yeah.
did a whole month-long celebration of J.R.R. Tolkien that month as well. Andrew also co-hosts this podcast, and I really recommend it. I've listened to a few episodes of it. Pints with Jack. It's a weekly C.S. Lewis podcast. There you go. There's the sticker. Wow. You've got I have a podcast myself, but I don't have nice stickers like
Oh
that.
man,
So,
we got swag.
and it's in its eighth season. So that's wow, pins and everything.
I wish I could
Okay,
push it through the
you're
camera to you
you're
there,
you're
Marty.
gonna have to hook me up, Andrew.
I could probably do that for you, friend.
And also, he's an avid book collector. He sells rare vintage Lewis books on eBay at c.s.lewis fan. And he does have some things that he's going to be putting up for the holidays. So, people, if you have not finished your Christmas shopping yet, and you have some C.S. Lewis fans, there you go, right in the chat. You can visit eBay and check out what he has because he has some Christmas presents he wants to buy too. So he needs to sell those things. Anyway, in 2009, Andrew published Mere Christians Inspiring Encounters with C.S. Lewis. And in 2013, he transcribed, edited, and published. This is pretty amazing. Published a previously unknown book by C.S. Lewis,
Mhm.
the groundbreaking early prose joy, Lewis's very first spiritual autobiography. And his ongoing research explores and explains. There you go. Wow. Explores and explains Till We Have Faces, the book that C.S. Lewis always considered his best. Andrew is a Episcopal priest serving in the Orlando, Florida area, which is exactly where Billy Collins lives. So that's pretty
Mhm.
cool too. And he's married to author. I always have to give I also have to give credit to wives and spouses and significant others, because I know for myself I couldn't do what I do if it weren't for having a really strong person behind me supporting me. So
Absolutely.
he is married to author and speaker Dr. Kristen Ditchfield Lazo. And you can find out more about him at andrewlazo.com. So I'm going to stop talking now because I want to hear what Andrew has to say about C.S. Lewis. So why don't you take over, Andrew?
Well, thank you, Marty, and thank you for the kind invitation, and welcome to everybody who's watching either live or will watch at some point in the future. Um, and what a joy to be with you. And oh my gosh, listening to the run-up of events, I'm thinking about moving to Michigan, for pity's sake. It sounds like a wonderful time. I'm delighted to be asked to talk about C.S. Lewis. I've been a priest for a couple of years, but before that, I was a high school English teacher. I taught regular ninth grade English. I taught football players how to love poetry. Pray for me now and in the hour of my death. And and one of the things that really always shocked them is that people would pay for me to talk about C.S. Lewis. My students would pay me to shut up about him, and so it's a delight to share my love of Lewis. And I hope that this is helpful. I'm going to leave some time for questions, and so I've got a quick little outline. I'm going to probably touch on some things fairly quickly in order to kind of get some breadth. But if you want to delve more deeply, I'd be delighted to take your questions. Sometimes when I give this presentation on Lewis's life and work, I just sit at the edge of my desk and say, "What do you all want to know?" But perhaps that's not as convenient to do over Zoom. And so I'll go through first Lewis's life and then his work. And then I also want to discuss especially Shadowlands and kind of Lewis and popular culture, especially some of the movies that are out there. And Lewis continues to command an audience. So um, to begin with, I want to look at Lewis, and in my own work, I kind of look at Lewis as both a door and a doorway. So for me as a person, for me as a Christian person, a believer in things, Lewis becomes a great model for me. His humility, his sense of humor, his ongoing charities. So as a personal example, he has been very fruitful for me to study and learn about his life. His stepson, Douglas Gresham, who's in his 70s now, once told me, I think we were at Lewis's home, the Kilns in Oxford, and Doug said, "You know, the thing that the biographers always miss about Jack," that was his nickname, Jack. Lewis came downstairs one day when he was 2.5 years old and pointed to himself and said, "His name is Jaxie." And he would never answer to any other name but Jaxie, Jax, or Jack. And his stepson gave me permission to call him by his nickname. He said the thing that the biographers miss about Jack and his home was the prevailing sense of laughter. And he was always enjoying and laughing at things. So not only a door, but a doorway. His works continue to fly off the shelves. Uh, right now, I believe there's only one of his books that is out of print. And if you ever try to find C.S. Lewis books in a rare bookstore or even at Barnes and Noble, usually, especially around this time of the year, it's hard to keep him on the shelves. And so he continues to inspire readers and to reach every generation. So let me just break this down by decades. And the second link that I gave you, the link to mythoflove.net or andrewlazo.com will get you to the same spot. I have a page of free resources that are downloadable. And so in the back of my book, Mere Christians, I did a little list of books by Lewis. Um, and then I did a list of books about Lewis, some of the best resources. And then at the front of the book, I did a brief biography by decades. Um, and all three of those are available for free download on that link. I don't get anything from it. I just, if it would be helpful to you to have a little thumbnail guide to Lewis, it's there. Another question that I get a lot, and so I'll get this out of the way right now, and it's there on the resources page, is where should I start? What Lewis should I read next? And that's, of course, always a difficult question. And in person, I usually reply, well, what do you like to read? Because Lewis himself said that he'd never read more than a page and a half of a book he didn't enjoy. And he read everything. He said of his childhood that his upbringing was one of endless books. There were books everywhere. My parents bought every book of their passing interest and never got rid of one of them. There were books piled shoulder high in the cistern attic upstairs. There were books piled too deep on the great bookcase on the landing going up the stairs. There were books suitable for a child and books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy Irish afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves. I always had that same certainty of finding a book that was new to me, as a man walking into a field has of finding a new blade of grass. Lewis read amazingly widely, and he read English, French, Latin, Greek, German, Icelandic, medieval Italian, modern Italian, Anglo-Saxon, Old Norse. And he said he never read more than a page and a half of a book he didn't enjoy. And so I recommend this little article I did for Christian History Magazine, just to find a book that might be suitable for you. But I think Lewis would insist, and I would urge, read a page or two, and if you don't like it, just set it aside. You might not be old enough yet. It took me 25 years, God forgive me, to read Pride and Prejudice and really understand its brilliance. And so I think that especially for reading for pleasure, read for pleasure and reread for pleasure as well. I'll get off my English teaching soapbox and get back to the biography of Lewis. A door in a doorway. He opened the door for me not only to his own works, but also to the works of so many others. And so I'll spend a little bit of time on the categories, and that's in that article that's there on my website from Christian History Magazine. Born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, 1898. On November 29th. So we just celebrated his birthday. My podcast and I, we started last year C.S. Lewis Reading Day. Tolkien has 3 days every year. His birthday, the day Bilbo and Frodo's birthday, and then the day of the destruction of the ring, which is also the day of the Annunciation. But Lewis didn't have a reading day, so we did something about that. And so piteswithjack.com started some good ruckus. Had a very happy childhood. His father was a lawyer. His mother, unusually, was college educated. She had gone to Queen's University in Belfast, and she helped to tutor him as a young boy. Um, a very happy relationship with his older brother. Endless books, of course, and they wrote their own. Kind of upper middle class, some cousins nearby, and a very bright boy, a very happy boy. But a lot of that changed around Lewis's age 9. And so his mother got sick from cancer and died in the home. That was the end of three deaths, three deaths close in time. His maternal grandfather had died, his paternal uncle had died, and then his mother died. And 2 weeks after her death, his father, the Belfast lawyer, sent him to one of the worst boarding schools in England. Although he tried to find a good one, he just wasn't up to the task. The headmaster of that school where Lewis went, after Lewis left, was committed to a hospital for the criminally insane. He was beaten and very unhappy. The death of his mother and the unhappiness of the school contributed to Lewis's loss of faith. His parents were both believing Christians, observant Christians, but he gladly kind of surrendered that faith, stopped trying to manufacture religious feelings. He was also getting instruction that kind of assumed that Christianity was wrong. G.K. Chesterton, right around this time, said the Christian ideal hasn't been tried and found wanting, it's been found difficult and left untried. Well, that may be true, but that's certainly what Lewis saw. And so he just gladly assumed with most of his educators that it was false and gladly left behind the unpleasant obligations that he had found in his boyhood religion. His teenage years were marked by some bad schools or schools that he didn't much like, but then he was finally allowed for 3 years to go and live with a tutor who taught him Greek and Latin and prepared him for Oxford. And these were amazingly happy days. Lewis seems to have been an introvert. And so learning Greek in the morning by reading the Iliad, learning Latin in the afternoon by reading the Aeneid, and then endless reading on nights and weekends, and enough pocket money to have books, and correspondence with his brother and his father and his and a dear friend from across the street back in Belfast. So, educated in England. Although as an Irishman, he was not obligated to go to the war. He volunteered and commissioned a second lieutenant in the Somerset Light Infantry Division. And while he was in Oxford, he matriculated to Oxford, but then volunteered for service. And he met there a young man named Paddy Moore. They were roomed alphabetically, so Lewis and Moore were in the same room. Seems to have met Paddy's mother, Mrs. Moore, Janie King Askins Moore, and developed, I think, a bit of an attraction to her. He and Paddy promised each other that they would take care of their remaining parent in case either of them died during the war. And in fact, when Paddy died, Lewis cared for Mrs. Moore for the rest of his life. She was 45 when he was 19, and it appears, we don't have any hard proof, but it appears that they had a romantic and even sexual relationship, which seems a little strange. But she was an attractive woman, and he was an attractive and clever young man, and they lived together for the rest of her natural life. That relationship over time kind of morphed into a mother-child relationship, and he referred to her as his aged mother. So his 20s were beginning in the war, and then matriculated to Oxford. He did excellently well at Oxford, won a double first-class degree in classics, which is still the most difficult degree in Oxford. And then because he could find no jobs teaching when he graduated in 1925, he begged his father for one more year of support while he finished the 2-year English program and wrote the equivalent of 800 or 600 pages and read hundreds of books and articles and things. And he did it in an 8-month period and got another first-class degree. He was ridiculously well-read and educated, and a fervent non-believer. In 25, began teaching philosophy, and that led to a job teaching English at Magdalen College in Oxford for 29 years. Um, that that education, or his teaching, especially of philosophy, led him to develop a philosophy of his own. And he came in with the presumption that Christianity wasn't true. But as he followed it along, he said later that he was led rationally to at least consider the claims of Christianity. They seemed to be the only ones that rang true to him. Um, he also met many people who seemed to have this kind of fatal character flaw, both writers and colleagues. They were all Christians, but they were the most intriguing ones. A big influence on him was G.K. Chesterton and, of course, George MacDonald, two great writers for Lewis. It was around this time, 1926, that he met J.R.R. Tolkien. He went home that May afternoon after the faculty meeting, and he said, I met Tolkien of Exeter today. He's a smooth, pale, fluent chap. There's no harm in him. He only needs a smack or so. But moving on from wanting to smack him, they soon became good friends. They read Old Norse together, and then Tolkien shared some of his poetry with Lewis, and Lewis responded with great enthusiasm and then also healthy criticism. Tolkien was an ardent Catholic all of his life, and in his discussions with Lewis, helped Lewis to see Christianity in a new light. And so in 1930, Lewis converted to theism, to a belief in God. In 1931, a belief in Christianity, and began communicating, receiving communion at his local parish church. And that was where his philosophical journey, in some point, found a home. And so he became a Christian and remained a Christian the rest of his life. During the 30s, he and Tolkien founded a group called the Inklings. They dabbled, these are writers, they dabbled in ink, but they also thought that they had an inkling of how the universe worked. These were all Christian men who were united by education and location. And so they would meet at the pub on Tuesday mornings for a pint of beer and good fun talk. And then on Thursday evenings would meet in Lewis's rooms to read their manuscripts to each other and receive and give great, no holds barred, hand and fist criticism. And that's where all of The Hobbit was written, most of The Lord of the Rings, the Screw Tape Letters was written in the Inklings, The Great Divorce, many of Lewis's science fiction books, and so that became kind of a crucible of creativity for them. The author Diana Glyer has written a marvelous book called The Company They Keep: C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien as Writers in Community. Diana spent 25 years reading every word by all 19 Inklings. 365 books, and every poem and essay. And then she wrote a book about what it must be like. And her prose style is beautiful. So The Company They Keep, Diana Pavlik Glyer on Kent State University Press. I give you a money back guarantee on that book. It's marvelous. The 40s were the years of the Inklings as well, not only the 30s, but also the 40s. Most of Lewis's major works came out then. Problem of Pain, the talks on the BBC that became Mere Christianity, The Great Divorce came out, Miracles, the science fiction books were all there. He was writing many essays, giving talks to the British, the British Academy and other learned societies. And the Inklings were thriving then. One of their company, Charles Williams, died unexpectedly in 1945, and 4 years later, the Inklings kind of stopped meeting. Now, the men continued to meet throughout their lifetimes, but as a group, that group kind of ran from 1933 to 1949. Lewis's brother Warren came home one night in 1945 and recorded of the Inklings meeting in his diaries, "No one turned up." In 1949, Joy Davidman, who would become C.S. Lewis's wife, began corresponding with him. In 1950, Lewis's mother slash house companion um, got ill, went into a nursing home, and died in 1951. Um, and in 1950, between 1948 and 1953, Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, as well as his autobiography, his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Um, that then led to, and there was a continuing correspondence with Joy Davidman, who came to visit him in England in 1952, and in 53 moved to London, and then not long after moved to Oxford. She and Lewis were the best of friends, but we've just discovered in the last 15 or 20 years or so that she was secretly writing love sonnets to C.S. Lewis. And so there's a book called A Naked Tree, which collects all of her poems. And the wonderful Lewis scholar and editor Don W. King has published all 45 of her love sonnets to C.S. Lewis. We're not quite certain if he ever read them, but when I spoke with Lewis's secretary, Walter Hooper, before Walter died, Walter said that when Lewis died, he found Joy's poems on Lewis's desk. So we hope that he did read those. So the 50s were the breaking up of the Inklings, the dying of Mrs. Moore, but the incoming of Joy Davidman Also in 1954, was elected to a professorship at Cambridge. He had labored for 29 years as a tutor, which is a relatively lower rank in the in the university system. But they created a professorship for him at Cambridge, and they allowed him to travel back and forth to Oxford and maintain his residence there. And so he happily accepted the post and began as a professor at Cambridge in 1955. Wrote Till We Have Faces with Joy Davidman in 55. That became the place, I believe, and my book will argue that Lewis fell in love with Joy, although he didn't admit it to himself until she got cancer in 1956, and he realized that he was about to lose her. He married her in 56 to extend his citizenship so she and her sons could stay. In 57, married her at her bedside in a religious ceremony, thinking that he would become a bridegroom and a widower in the same breath. But she experienced a miraculous remission of her cancer. A priest student friend of Lewis's laid hands on her, and she had a break from her cancer. And they had 3 very happy years together until she died in 1960. In 1963, Lewis had several bouts of illness. He had kidney issues. He had shrapnel in his chest from the war, from the Great War. And that prevented him from being operated on for his kidneys. And it was the year before a couple of years before dialysis was invented. So had some kidney issues, and in the fall of 1963 passed away. In fact, he died on November 22nd, 1963, and within the same hour as John F. Kennedy's assassination, and on the same day as the death of Aldous Huxley. And so that's a little bit about his life. He thought that his works would go out of print within 5 years. But we find that that's certainly not true. His friend Walter Hooper said, "No, Jack, that won't happen because your readers are too smart and your books are too good." Walter then became Lewis's kind of amanuensis, an editor. Walter had met Lewis the last year of his life and then edited a number of Lewis's books and found a collection of essays and poems and letters and things and began putting out books by Lewis. He approached Lady Collins, who was one of the owners of the Collins Publishing, which is now HarperCollins, and offered new books by Lewis to Lady Collins. And she said, "I'd love them." And he said, "One condition: for every new book by Lewis that I bring you, you have to put 2 of his books that are out of print back into print." And she did that. And that's why all of Lewis's books, except for one collection of essays, are still in print. And even those essays have appeared in other essay collections that are published. So, um, so that's a little quick run up of his life. And now I want to just give a kind of a quick overview. And I see you're welcoming folks in. Hello to Marge and to Dave. Just some categories, and you can find these also in some of the downloads that I've pointed you to. Um, Lewis wrote widely, and so I like to say that Lewis is a great way to find out how good your bookstore is. So if you go into a used bookstore and look for books that Lewis might have written, you'll go to the academic section, and he wrote academic books that were still being used when I was in grad school in the early 2000s. He wrote widely in fiction. He wrote science fiction, wrote children's fiction. He called Till We Have Faces far and away my best book, and I hope to prove why that is. He wrote juvenilia. He wrote the children's books, and then they also have published the books that he and his brother wrote when they were children, tales of dressed up animals, but they're very, very dull because Lewis found adults talking very dull and thought that that's what characters should talk like in his books. And so if you buy Boxen, don't expect great literary anticipations of the Chronicles of Narnia. They're a little dry. Um, he also wrote, it's hard to quantify these or categorize these, theological fiction, speculative fiction. And so The Great Divorce is about a bus ride from purgatory. It's a dream vision of a bus ride from purgatory to heaven. And so kind of hard to categorize that one. Of course, the screw tape letters, which brought him enormous fame. These are letters from a senior devil to a junior devil, teaching the younger devil how to damn a soul. So all of his spiritual advice is upside down. It was a masterpiece. Screw tape letters was of perspective and point of view. And so for many years, secular high schools would have that on the required reading list. Um, wrote a lot of apologetics. Apologia is the Greek word for defense, and Lewis was a defender of the Christian faith. He wanted to explain to common people why Christianity could be accepted by thoughtful, logical, rational people, which is what had happened to him. He was a great writer of essays. And if you have an Audible credit just burning its hole in your pocket, there's over 100 of Lewis's essays. Many of them are fairly short, and they are just masterpieces of clear thinking about loads of subjects, literary, theological, psychological, cultural, and you get a lot of good bang for your buck if that's your sort of thing. As I was talking with Marty early on, Lewis, after he published the Screwtape Letters, he considered it his Christian obligation to answer every letter that he received in the order he received them. And so over his lifetime, he probably answered maybe 50,000 letters. They are published in 3 volumes, totaling 3,800 pages. Volume 3 is hard to get, and in fact, I'm going to put it up on my eBay soon. It was originally, I don't know, 30 or 40 bucks, but it's now running around $400. 1,800 pages just covering the years from 1950 to 1963. And because he answered so many letters, they are delightful. They're terse, they're witty, they're generous, they're gracious. You can almost hear the twinkle in Lewis, or see the twinkle in Lewis's eye as you read his letters. And then he wrote a number of autobiographies. Surprised by Joy, which early prose joy, which I discovered, was written before his conversion to Christianity, but after he came to believe in a God. Um, and then Surprised by Joy, The Pilgrim's Regress. In fact, he was always, I think, writing autobiographically. Wrote a memoir of his grief after Joy Davidman died in 1960. Did it under a pseudonym, but his publisher, T.S. Eliot, convinced him to publish it under his name after his death. And that book is called A Grief Observed. Delicious book and heartrending and honest. And Lewis really grappled with some of his doubts. So that's a quick overview to his life and his work. I'm going to try to finish a little sooner than I had even told Marty, just so that I could allow you all to as many questions as I can answer for you. The last thing that I do want to do, though, maybe spend 5 or 6 minutes on this. I want to talk about Lewis in popular culture and particularly Lewis at the movies. Please excuse me. So you'll be screening the movie Shadowlands in a couple of weeks, and I once asked Douglas Gresham about that movie, and he said it's kind of a lousy biography, but it's a really good movie. And so Douglas Douglas had a brother, an older brother, David, and the author, the screenwriter, William Nicholson, has kind of conflated those two boys. So if you've seen or will see that movie, the two boys are conflated into just Doug. Um, uh, Bill Nicholson actually wrote a play, and then the BBC did a version of that movie starring Joss Ackland and Claire Bloom, and that's a little more closer to accurate. But again, a biographer is also telling their own story as they're telling someone else's story. And so both are lovingly but not hagiographically written, if you will. They're not slavishly devoted. They're not, they don't seem to be, kind of a whitewashing fanboy creating these movies. Um, and they're trying to show at least the aspect of Lewis's life where he falls in love with Joy Davidman and deals with her death, which was certainly one of the most important parts of his life. He said to his friend Neville Coghill, um, one afternoon. He said, I was so surprised in my 60s to discover the happiness that had passed me by in my 20s. And so she certainly was a vigorous and a lively person in Lewis's life, and his tribute to her in A Grief Observed is well worth your attention. So Shadowlands, an excellent movie, put out in 93, I think, 92, 93, starring Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. From what I've heard, I think Tony Hopkins didn't read a word of Lewis to prepare for the role, and so Hopkins kind of portrayed Hopkins. But I actually got a chance to meet Deborah Winger once, and I understand that she came to the C.S. Lewis archive at the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Illinois, and spent a week sitting at Lewis's dining room table and discussing with Joy Davidman's biographer how she was and what she was like. And I find her portrayal very captivating. I do highly recommend Patty Callahan, the best-selling author, wrote a book called Becoming Mrs. Lewis. And while it's biographical fiction, Patty really did her work. She came to the Wade Center. She consulted with me before she revised and put out the second edition of her book. And Patty, while a fiction writer, she was trying to write a novel, nevertheless wrote a really good telling of Joy Davidman. And I find it to be, in some ways, the best biography, even though it's not a biography, it's a novel. And I've participated with some of the other biographies. And read them all, and Patty really kind of gets a sense of the trajectory of this woman who would fall in love and make Lewis terribly happy. Um, in the early 2000s, Walden Media put out three of the Chronicles of Narnia. The first one, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I'd probably give a B plus to. It sold $745 million of movie tickets. And so there's a real hunger for Narnia. The second one, Prince Caspian with Hunky Ben Barnes. Um, I'd probably give a C minus to. It was okay. And then I remember going to the midnight showing of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and I turned to my friend and said, "Well, at least I'll never have to watch any of these movies ever again." It was just so. That's my favorite Narnia book, Dawn Treader, and I had no idea what was coming next in the movie. So, kind of a regrettable approach. Um, the, I'm glad that they came out. There are some of the things that some of the bits of it were marvelous, but not ones that I would recommend people to watch if they wanted to catch what was happening with Narnia. Fortunately, Netflix has bought the rights to Narnia, and as you may be aware, Greta Gerwig of Little Women fame and Barbie fame has been tapped to direct the first two Narnia movies. I'm sorry, two Narnia movies for Netflix. We are not sure which books she'll do. I have a friend called Glumpuddle is his handle, and his site is Narnia Web, and he keeps track of all of the movie rumors and everything. And so he's watching carefully over that. I heard the other day that Saoirse Ronan is maybe going to have a role. So Greta Gerwig said of Barbie that Barbie is a story that I first learned in my Catholic upbringing and in my Catholic education as a high school student. It's a story that I read in Genesis about a woman who wakes up in innocence and has to navigate a fallen world. And so Greta has some Christian sensibilities, which I think will probably serve her well. I'm not asking for an evangelistic movie to be made. I just want one that really captures the magic of the Narnias that I read long before I ever attended any church. There's some wonderful inspiration, especially in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But I hope that she captures the magic of that book. Um, you may be aware around the country of a fella called Max McLean and Fellowship for Performing Arts, and his productions of Lewis are fantastic. Max has worked very closely with the Lewis Company and has not changed almost anything. about the productions that he's done. Most famously, he has done a production of the Screwtape Letters, and he's been in front of over 500,000 people, including Nancy Pelosi and Samuel Alito and dozens and dozens of others, hundreds of others, thousands of others. All around the country, and that show is still touring. In fact, it's going to make a swing through Florida in January. So you can find out more at fpatheater.com, or just look up Fellowship for Performing Arts or C.S. Lewis on Stage, Screwtape on Stage. His one-man show of the Screwtape Letters, fantastic. When he's not performing the role, Brent Harris of Broadway fame is doing that. Brent was the Scar in the Lion King touring company and does a marvelous job. Max has also done a production of The Great Divorce with a number of actors playing several of the different roles. Fantastic show. And then he did a show about Lewis's conversion up until his theistic and Christian conversion up until 1931, called Most Reluctant Convert. And that live stage show was very popular, very well received, excellently well done. And then the pandemic hit. And so they pivoted and filmed a movie of Most Reluctant Convert, starring Nicholas Ralph, who plays the lead character in All Creatures Great and Small. And so wonderful movie, a version of that. Max has now done a movie of Lewis in the 40s, or not a movie, but a stage play called Further Up and Further In, and he really captures a great deal of Lewis's humor. So I highly recommend Fellowship for Performing Arts and Max McLean. Last year, a movie came out called Freud's Last Session, because there was a comment that Freud's last session was with an Oxford professor. And Armin Nicolai, a Harvard medical school professor and psychologist, had written a book called The Question of God, contrasting the theistic worldview of Lewis and the atheistic worldview of Freud. And that's a course that he taught, a worldview course that he taught at Harvard Med School for 25 years. And in the end, Nicolai mentions that Freud's last session was with an Oxford professor. And so Mark St. Germain, the playwright, wrote a play called Freud's Last Session and then did a movie of it. And that movie, ironically enough, stars Anthony Hopkins as Sigmund Freud. So he's come full circle. Matthew Good plays Lewis. It's pretty good. We had a screening of it here in Orlando, and then a psychologist, psychology professor, and I did a little talk back, and certainly worth your time. And then, yeah, that's it. Um, Lewis is everywhere. He haunts people's music. Bono and U2 at one point did a animated video for a song that they did for a Spider-Man soundtrack, or a Batman soundtrack. And at one point in the animation, the Batmobile goes by Bono, knocks him over, and a book flies out of his hands. And the close-up shows Bono reading the Screwtape Letters. And Bono said his Mephisto character from the Fly era was based on loosely on Screwtape. Yeah, you find references to Lewis all over the place. Even Family Guy has got Peter Griffin looking for a lost sock and falling through his dryer into Narnia and seeing the sock on Mr. Tumnus's ear as he runs away. So just really pervasive in our culture. But we're at 7:14. I finished early, at least a minute early. And if you have any questions or if there's anything that you'd like to say, I would be delighted to be of service to you during the rest of our time together.
Awesome.
I'll take a breath now.
Yeah, take a breath, take a drink. Thank you so much for that. That was really fascinating. So, Marge or Dave, if you want to unmute yourself, if you have any questions, or you can put them in chat as well, and I'll read those. But I do have. I'll ask the first question. So if a person is not really familiar with C.S. Lewis,
Yep.
where would you recommend that they begin?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'll drop a link in here. It's on my website as well, but I'll drop the direct link. So I was asked to write an article called Spending a Pleasant Hour with C.S. Lewis, basically answering that question, where should I start? And on that link, what I've done is divided up the literary genres. So letters, diaries, autobiographies, fiction and poetry, popular theology, essays and addresses, scholarly works, quotations and selections. And then what I've done is given a quick overview about the kinds of things that he wrote, and then selected one or two things to really start with. And so that would be a place. And then at the end, I have a few suggestions about how to start reading Lewis.
Okay.
Basically, though, especially if you're reading for your own pleasure, what I would do is wander into Barnes and Noble or a used bookstore, or pull up a page on Amazon and read the first. If it's a novel, maybe read the first chapter. Or if it's a short story, the first paragraph, or, even the first couple of pages. And if you
Mhm.
find that that's not your sort of book, set it aside. And
Mhm.
you're probably not old enough to read it yet.
Mhm.
Um, but suit your taste. Lewis said, when one has read a book, I find there's nothing so nice as discussing it with someone else, even though it tends to produce rather fierce arguments. So find a book that you really enjoy, and find a book that you're willing to fight with somebody about, and then go pick a
Mhm.
fight. Um,
Okay.
so, which of your scenes are your favorite, or how well does this or that happen? Maybe discussing that book. Lewis book clubs are all around, and there are a lot of online Lewis societies and talks and things. And so, I would probably start there, but suit your taste and
Mhm.
read only what you love. The one thing I didn't do in my talk is talk about the rest of the doorway. And Lewis has opened so many doors for me. I found William Wordsworth, and I learned how to love poetry because of Lewis. I, of course, read Tolkien and Chester. I tried reading Tolkien for years until I found out that he and Lewis were such good friends. Chesterton, and then actually to understand all of Western literature, I went back to school and majored in English and minored in Latin and medieval studies, not just because that's where all the great parties were. I wanted to learn about Western literature so that I could understand Lewis's references. And that led me to the great delights of a minor in Latin, learning, reading Ovid and Horace, and oh my gosh, all of the things. And so Lewis really always points to other authors. If you read Surprised by Joy, there are hundreds of authors that he mentions. And his marvelous Oxford History of English Literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, which sounds like a real snore fest, is actually just delightfully written, and it's just been republished, I believe, by HarperCollins. So that Oxford History of English Literature took him 9 years to write. That's why he called it the Oh Hell, which are its initials. But I would just say start where you want to start. If you're an adult and haven't read Narnia since you were a kid, reread that. And maybe get a hold of Michael Ward's Planet Narnia. He discovered that the seven Narnia novels relate to the seven medieval planets in really intriguing and
Mhm.
theological ways. The science fiction trilogy, if you like that sort of thing, marvelous stuff. His late book, Experiment and Criticism, explores not whether it's a good or bad book, but whether it's a literary or a non literary reader. And just the passages at the beginning of that book, a couple of pages where he describes the difference between literary readers who set much stock in their reading and non literary people who don't. And he says that for literate people, mouth over their favorite lines and passages. They're always looking for silence in which to read and do it devotedly as soon as they find it. Books for them become a sort of iconography by which to sum up or interpret their existence, right? And so if you love to read, even that first chapter of experimental in criticism is very much worth your time. So Lewis almost touches on nothing that he doesn't illuminate. So I would start there.
Okay.
Collections of essays are also a really good place to start.
Mhm.
So I think it depends on what your tastes are.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, the breadth of his work and the different genres that he wrote in. Did he, because you said that he excluded drama from you said that. Did he write plays at
He
all?
did
Or
not. He did
okay.
not. That was not his gift. He didn't care for detective. novels.
Mm,
Although his great master, G.K. Chesterton, was a detective
yeah.
novelist, and his dear friend Dorothy L. Sayers, of course, wrote
Mm,
the Lord Peter Wimsey novels. Um, but he never, I think, he tried. He tried Till We Have Faces as a mask, Masque, and it didn't really work. His friend Owen Barfield, oh, I think I've got it here somewhere, um, wrote a play about Orpheus that Lewis read. But yeah, that was not one of the genres that he wrote in. So
huh,
another great place to start too. There's a single volume paperback of Lewis's letters, and
mm,
that's a marvelous place to just open up and just rummage around anywhere. You can just open it in the middle of the book and start reading a letter. And I often find oh, Dave, no worries. I often find that just starting to read his letters, an hour and a half will go by before I look up at the time.
yeah.
Great question, Dave, and thanks for asking. Tolkien and Lewis became friends primarily because of their association in the English department at Oxford University. In 1925, Lewis became a tutor or a fellow or a don at Magdalen College. It's spelled Magdalen, but they pronounce it Maudlin. A tutor takes students in one-to-one tutorials once a week and also gives courses of lectures at Oxford and then also publishes in their field. And so at Oxford to this day, you can just go into the lecture hall, anybody can, and you may hear a brilliant physicist doing a 4 or 6 week introduction to, quantum mechanics or something like that. Um, and so Lewis was a tutor and he tutored English. He gave lectures. Tolkien was a professor, and a professor gives courses of lectures just like tutors do and publishes, but they don't do anything else. And so a professorship is much more prestigious. It's much better paid and it's much less work. Um, and so Tolkien was the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. That chair or that professorship has since been renamed the Tolkien Chair. And he made significant contributions to Middle English, Old English. He worked on Beowulf. In fact, the foundational essay in Beowulf criticism is Tolkien's essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And that's just where Tolkien or Beowulf criticism really starts in the 20th century. So, as members of the English faculty, they met at a faculty meeting in May of 1926. And Lewis records in his diary that he called Tolkien a smooth, pale, fluent chap. No harm in him. He only needs a smack or so. But the next year in 1926, and I didn't mention this earlier, Tolkien started an Old Norse reading group. This group was called the Kolbitar, or the coal biters. These were the Old Norse, the Vikings, the Icelandic people who would sit so close to the fire they could bite the coals. And instead of being out rampaging like a good Viking, they were telling over the old tales. And so Tolkien gathered a few friends and a few professors to read Old Norse together. And they read all of Snorri Sturluson, all of the sagas that you've heard of, you know, and Njal Saga and the Vineland sagas, and they read everything they could in Old Norse in the original language. Tolkien could read for pages because he was a linguist, he was a philologist. The rest of them had to really do their homework and use a crib. Um, but Lewis was invited into the coal biters, and he found a shared interest in mythology with Tolkien. Lewis was an atheist, Tolkien was an ardent Catholic, but they found a commonality in their love of mythology and their love of all things northern. Northernness was a watchword for them. And so, after a couple of years of learning that they could trust each other's likes, Tolkien reluctantly, shyly, but bravely in some ways uh, gave the story of Beren and Luthien, the Lay of Luthien to C.S. Lewis. It's a kind of an origin myth for the Lord of the Rings. And he said, Jack, here's this poem I've been writing. Would you care to read it? Lewis said certainly, and Lewis loved to read and loved to be read aloud too. So he took the poem home, read it all night, and sent a glowing page-and-a-half letter of praise to Tolkien the next day. And then 3 months later, sent him the manuscript with a critical apparatus and with these made-up professors. Professor so and so says that this must be a corrupted line because no poet in their right mind would ever say something so trivial as this. And so he criticized the work as if it was a discovered manuscript from some long lost medieval author, and created this whole kind of this apparatus of different scholars and critics taking the work really seriously and ripping it to shreds. Tolkien loved the praise as much as he loved the criticism, and that really was the birth of the Inklings and the birth of their friendship. They went on. Tolkien helped Lewis to see that all mythology came from God, in his opinion, which led to Lewis's Christian conversion. Lewis repaid this great debt by well, he didn't consider it a debt nor paying back. He loved to be read to. And so Tolkien later said after Lewis's death that Lewis was long his only critic. He said it was only through Lewis that he um, started, finished, and brought to publication The Lord of the Rings. It was only through his constant encouragement that he was able to finish the task, Tolkien said. Now, in addition to the 1,000 pages of Tolkien's legendarium, the Silmarillion, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, there are 12 volumes of false starts that Tolkien wrote, and Lewis heard every line in manuscript and loved it. And so he would often say, Tolkien, no, too much Hobbit talk, get to the action better. He was a great critic. And Tolkien, according to his son Christopher of blessed memory, who recently passed away, Tolkien marked most of the lines that Lewis criticized. And even if he ignored it, he thought about it. Lewis famously said of Tolkien, when asked if he had influenced Tolkien, he said, "Influence Tolkien? You may as well try to influence a Bandersnatch. Nobody influenced Tolkien." And his response to criticism was either to ignore it altogether or to set the whole thing aside and start all over again. And so you have the first 4 or 5 chapters of The Lord of the Rings written a number of times. Those have all been published as the History of Middle-earth, and those are available and really delightful to see. So it was around reading and writing and taking each other's work seriously that Lewis and Tolkien became friends, which fits what Lewis says in The Four Loves, that friends may start in a social gathering, but they separate from the crowd almost embarrassed because they love some particular thing. And so they met at a faculty meeting, but they loved writing poetry and writing, romance and writing legend and myth. And so they separate from the crowd so as not to be rude. And then that group that would separate would welcome a third or a fourth or a fifth. Friends, Lewis said, stand shoulder to shoulder, looking at the same thing the same way, which is true of NASCAR, of quilting, of whatever. And for Lewis and Tolkien, it was writing and myth. So
Fascinating.
sorry
Yeah.
for yes. And Lewis's idea of friendship, you can find in his book, The Four Loves, which is one of the most important and influential books to me as an adult. The first couple of chapters are a little tough going. He's teaching you how to think, but he writes these chapters on family love, which he calls storge, friendship love, which is philia, romantic love, which is eros, and agape or agape, which is divine love. And you can these were actually, um, uh, these were talks that Lewis gave um, in, sorry, here we go. Hang on, look at my library. Lewis gave these talks, and they're recorded. And those talks in 58 about the four loves, um, then he revised and published as and revised and then edited and put out as the book The Four Loves. So he gave four talks on love, and the reason why I'm stalling and looking uh, at my phone is because I want to play you just a bit. So this is the beginning. This is Lewis's actual voice and the beginning of the lecture on storge or family or national or patriot love.
In Greek, they have four words for love. Storge, S-T-O-R-G-E, means affection, the sort of love there ought to be between near relations. Philia, P-H-I-L-I-A, means friendship. Eros, E-R-O-S, is of course the love between the sexes. And agape, A-G-A-P-E, is love in the Christian sense, God's love for man and the Christian's love for the brethren. I want to talk about all four, and I'll begin with storge, or affection.
My favorite line here.
Almost anyone, it seems, can be loved with storge. The ugly, the stupid, even the exasperating can be its object. There need be no apparent fitness.
So there's storge. He doesn't sound Irish, does he?
No.
He's got a very Oxonian accent and a very deep and booming voice. In fact, they say that the Treebeard, Fangorn, the character with his deep booming shroom shroom voice, that Lewis was the inspiration for that voice. Lewis sometimes would go home to his native Ireland, jump in the cab, and give directions in his Oxonian accent, and then halfway through switch to a low Irish brogue just to mess with the cabbie sometimes. So, and I met one of Lewis's former students about 6 months before this man died, and he said that you could always tell when Lewis was lecturing, the bicycles were piled three deep outside the lecture hall. And Lewis would walk in the door and begin lecturing as he was unwrapping his muffler and walk down to the stage, no notes, and would give his lecture. And then, as the lecture was drawing to a conclusion at the end of the hour, would walk back up the stairs, wrap up his muffler, and then give the last sentence of the lecture, perfectly concluding everything, and walk right out the door. And so he was a famous lecturer, and you can get a few different recordings of his voice. So thanks. Sorry for the long answer for the good question, Dave.
That was really. Oh, well, we're right at the end of our time, but I have one question that I'm wondering. Because it sounds like Lewis really gave Tolkien a lot of suggestions and criticism. Was that reciprocal? Did Tolkien also help Lewis with his writing, or was that just, a one-way street there?
Yeah, again, I would recommend Diana Gleyer's book, and I promise not to take too long on this answer. Let me see if I can pull this up too. Yeah, good. Here we go. Here we go. Here's the company they keep. Oh, no, that won't do. Here. And so it looks at the way that the Inklings wrote together. And so that's a really excellent resource. Here we go. Here, I'll just do this. Yes, absolutely. They went at it hammer and tongs. It was kind of like Lennon and McCartney writing together. And even when they didn't write, if they didn't write together, they wrote in fear of each other. Tolkien began to leave out the stuff that he knew that Lewis would call him on. And so one doesn't know for sure. There aren't any recordings or records of what happened in Inklings meetings. But the kind of competitiveness that is generally associated with men and expressed often in athletics, that same kind of competitiveness was there in their intellectual meetings, and they really went at each other. They went at it hammer and tongs, and they criticized each other uproariously, and no quarter was asked or given, they said, of the Inklings meetings. And so certainly Tolkien was a listener. In fact, the Screwtape Letters is dedicated to J.R.R. Tolkien, but we're not exactly sure to what extent. But Diana's book is the best one to find out about that.
Okay. All right. So Dave, Marge, do you have any other questions, last minute questions or comments that you'd like to ask or say? Give you a second.
And
Right.
please allow me to thank you both for joining us.
Yes.
It's that's a full hour, and I appreciate your patience and your interest.
Well, I have to thank you, Andrew. It's just been such a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you before things started,
Yes.
I really recommend recommend that podcast that you're a part of, that weekly podcast. It's wonderful. If you are a fan of C.S. Lewis, that's something that you should really check out, because when I first Andrew was so kind to accept my invitation to do this, I was like, I wanted to find out some more, and so I started listening to that podcast, and
Mm.
it's just wonderful. I love podcasts. So you've accompanied me on many long walks when I've been
Oh,
going on
wonderful.
walks. So
I'm so glad. That's an honor.
yeah.
They were on for 2 seasons before they invited me as a guest, and
Mm-hmm.
then I became a co-host in season 4 with
Mm,
Screwtape Letters. You can find it anywhere you get podcasts,
yeah.
Spotify, YouTube, whatever. And I
Mm-hmm.
just threw in the link too. And so,
There you
mostly
go.
though, it's just a delight to be with my friends talking about the things that we love. We actually
Mm.
only met in person just this last year,
Oh wow.
just a couple of months ago at the wedding of one of our
Yeah,
co-hosts.
it's
So
amazing.
yeah,
Well, again, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Dave. And Marge just took off, but thanks, Marge, too, for showing up tonight.
yeah,
Please come to some of our other events this December that's connected to C.S. Lewis holidays. There's lots going on this month at the library. I know December is always a busy time for everybody, but do yourself a favor. At least show up for Shadowlands and the B plus of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because I've seen all the movies, and really The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is really the only one that I think is worth watching.
yeah,
So anyway, but I've been waiting for the Greta Gerwig one
yes,
on Netflix. I think that's going to be fantastic. So,
yeah.
all
Well, and
right,
I've
well,
thrown my email address in
okay,
there. First and foremost, I'm a priest, and as such, if I can ever be of service to any of your folks, please
awesome.
don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be honored to lend any hand in any way.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
thank you, Dave, for coming. And again, stop by. Thank you for hosting the Thank you, Dave.
Yes.
Thank you for coming. So excited that she showed up. Hopefully we'll see you at the library sometime. So I'm going to stop recording now. All right.